It's been 1 year since the infamous Oval Office fight, in which then newly re-inaugurated U.S. President Donald Trump told Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that he didn't have any cards.
You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right?
Trump meant, of course, that Ukraine didn't have any leverage in peace negotiations with Russia, implying that if Zelensky wanted his country to survive, he needed to play by Trump's rules. And enthusiastically. So in the years since that argument, Ukraine has largely done just that. Kyiv has signed the minerals deal, agreed to the terms of a ceasefire, and endorsed direct leader-to-leader meetings with Russia to end the war. But 1 year into Ukraine playing by Trump's rules and fully cooperating with the US-led peace talks, peace is as far away as ever. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and this week we're going to look at why the peace negotiations of the last 12 months have failed to end Russia's war against Ukraine, and whether we're actually close to a deal. So, quick background for those who need a recap. With the exception of a set of failed talks in the earliest days of Russia's 2022 full-scale invasion, for roughly 3 years there were no meaningful diplomatic negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. The talks in the early days failed quickly and with finality because the two sides were just irreconcilable. Still, during his 2024 re-election campaign, Donald Trump swore that he could act as peacemaker, claiming that he alone could get Putin and Zelensky to work out a deal quickly and without too much fuss. The first US-led talks between Ukrainian and Russian delegations began in late February of 2025. 1 year later, we've seen some modest gains. Prisoner exchanges, communication channels opened between diplomats, grudging gestures of cooperation. What we haven't seen in these 12 months are a ceasefire or a durable framework for peace. So what went wrong? To understand why peace talks haven't been effective, we first need to look at the motivations and tactics of our peacemaker. It's not debated that two-time American President Donald Trump is a capitalist rather than a humanist, more of a businessman than a historian, and impatient to a fault, all of which are attributes that aid in the buying and selling of real estate, but not in negotiating the end to an existential war. Trump framed the war as a failure by his predecessor that he would be celebrated for fixing, or, in short, he saw it as a box to tick or a deal to be negotiated. In his campaign, he claimed that his help would be received favorably, implying that both Russia and Ukraine wanted peace equally and just needed to be nudged toward an acceptable compromise. Trump's optimism that he himself was this missing piece has dissolved into frustration and impatience over the months as it became clearer and clearer to onlookers that the root of the conflict is not a single patch of disputed territory. It's the fact that Russia seeks a Ukraine that is neutralized, demilitarized, and politically subordinate. Ukraine, on the other hand, seeks freedom and deterrence against future invasion. Around the 6-month mark of these talks, Trump told CBS that, frankly, he thought Russia's war would be one of the easier conflicts to end, but that it's proved more difficult than anticipated. And Trump's patience is notoriously short, so it's nerve-wracking for Ukraine that America could wash its hands of the peace process at any time. However, US polling has consistently shown that doing so would be detrimental to Trump's domestic ratings, so Trump finds himself between a rock and a hard place. Abandoning Ukraine would make him look inhumane, but prolonged negotiations make him look impotent. As demonstrated by the Oval Office incident, Trump placed most of the initial pressure on Ukraine to compromise for the sake of a speedy result. Zelensky has since been forced to perform a delicate dance between not upsetting Trump to the point where he would cut off aid or intelligence sharing, but also not allowing Trump to sell out Ukraine's land and leave it defenseless against future Russian aggression. And the result has been about as good as one can hope. Trump and Zelensky have developed a civil-public relationship with no further blow-ups. At the same time, Trump has pushed for Ukraine to cede its territory, to sign away its minerals and resources in exchange for help, and has even publicly floated recognition of Russian control over occupied Crimea as a possible bargaining chip against Russia. On Russia and Putin, Trump's pressure has been lighter. Some sanctions, and more often, the threat of sanctions. Trump occasionally issues public admonitions condemning Russia's violence against Ukraine, but these are sporadic and can vary wildly in tone. See the time that he tweeted, "Vladimir, stop," after a mass attack on Ukraine. At various points, the White House suggested that it might supply longer-range weapons to Ukraine if Russia refused to negotiate, but those signals were also inconsistent and, in some cases, contradicted by administration officials within days. And then in tandem with the lighter pressure, Trump has thrown Putin more bones than he deserves, offering him a path back onto the international stage after years of exile. The fact that Trump welcomed Putin to U.S. soil in August, ignoring the fact that he's wanted by the International Criminal Court, tells you all you need to know about whether or not Trump is putting the fear of God in the Russian dictator's heart. There's also the fact that Trump just flat out likes Putin and always has. He seems wistfully impressed by Putin's totalitarian grip over Russia and wants the dictator to see him as a leader of equal heft, not someone to be played with. When Trump's tried to apply pressure to Russia, he's often been turned around by one quick phone call from Putin. Whether flattery or threats ultimately make up the bedrock of Putin's hold over the American president is up for debate. Before we move on, I want to quickly thank the viewers and readers who have kept us going through the hardest winter of Russia's invasion yet. The Kyiv Independent is funded by our readers and viewers, meaning that none of this would be possible without you. If you'd like to join our community and help support independent journalism in Ukraine, while also getting some cool perks to let you engage more closely with our work, there will be a link to our membership page in the description below. I'd also like to thank everyone who donates directly via YouTube. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thus far, we've focused primarily on Trump as the leader of the talks. But now we're going to move away from the execution and more into the substance of the negotiations. As it stands, these are Ukraine's conditions for ending the war: security guarantees from allies to sufficiently deter future invasion, justice for war crimes that Russia has committed, the return of the thousands of Ukrainian children illegally deported to Russia, and no legal recognition of Russia's rule over occupied territory. Ukraine has come around to willingness to freeze the fighting along the front lines as delineated at the time of the deal, but not to retreat from territory that it currently controls. Russia's demands, on the other hand, are that Ukraine cede the remainder of its eastern Donbas region, limit its military, and scrap any hope of joining NATO. In other words, this is something that Putin could sell to the Russian public as a victory in the short term and then use as favorable ground to take the rest of Ukraine in the future. A demilitarized Ukraine with no security guarantees and no hope of joining a military alliance is a Ukraine that could be easily reinvaded and defeated within just a few years, and that is every Ukrainian's biggest fear. But it is far from inevitable. If Russia can't beat Ukraine on its own now, they have no chance at defeating a Ukraine with robust security guarantees and alliances. And that is the fear of every Russian who believes that it's not too late to recreate the Soviet Union. On the multiple occasions when Ukraine has pushed back on a proposed framework that doesn't have sufficient security guarantees or otherwise violates Ukraine's key terms, Trump has painted the debate as stubbornness on Zelensky's part. Trump and his administration have accused Zelensky and his administration of prolonging the war and suffering of the Ukrainian people and military, while failing to acknowledge one key fact. Those people and that military overwhelmingly support Zelensky's view that a bad peace is worse than no peace.
Факт переговорів завжди шанс зменшити кількість жертв, але поки що виглядає як політичний процес, а не реальний шлях до миру. Бо мир – це не просто підписаний папір, а гарантії безпеки. Якщо їх немає, то це лише пауза перед новою війною.
In my opinion, no. None of those peace talks have brought Ukraine any step closer to peace. In my opinion, it's all just talking.
Якщо дивитися чесно, головна перешкода – це небажання Росії відмовитися від агресії та окупації територій. Коли одна сторона хоче миру, а інша диктує ультиматуми, домовленості бути не може. Мир не будується на шантажі.
На мою думку, єдина перепона для мирної угоди – це позиція російського президента, який вважає, що він може перемогти українську армію на полі бою. Якби він так не вважав, то ми б давно вже обговорювали якісь реальні сценарії припинення вогню. І саме тому дуже дивує позиція Сполучених Штатів, які вважають, що для досягнення мирної угоди треба тиснути не тільки на Росію, але й на Україну. Тому що якщо Україна припинить себе захищати, то вона просто зникне. Якщо Росія припине нападати на нашу країну, то війна закінчиться.
Щоб війна закінчилася по-справжньому, потрібно 3 речі. Припинення агресії та виведення військ. Реальні міжнародні гарантії безпеки. Справедливість і відповідальність за злочини. Бо без справедливості миру не буде. Буде лише тиша перед наступним ударом.
Щоб війна закінчилася, треба, щоб у Росії закінчилися гроші на війну. А для цього треба і далі тиснути на Російську Федерацію за допомогою санкцій, вибивати її потужності по нафтообробці і збільшувати ціну війни для країни-агресора. І для цього позиція Заходу повинна полягати в тому, що не на Україну треба тиснути, а треба зменшувати кількість доступних грошей для російського режиму. Це все, що це єдиний шлях, який може призвести до того, щоб в якийсь момент російська переговорна група сідала обговорювати справжні умови закінчення війни.
Do you support, if given the order, would you withdraw from the Ukrainian controlled part of Donbass? No. Straight up, no. I wouldn't listen to any of those orders. We've lost too many defending those areas.
Я вважаю, що виходити зі своєї землі – це дуже важке і болюче рішення. Кожен клаптик території – це домівки людей, могили рідних, історія. Просто віддати означає залишити своїх громадян. Військовий наказ є наказом, але внутрішньо я не підтримую ідею поступок агресора, бо це не приносить миру, а лише заохочує нові вимоги.
Zelensky's stance in negotiations is the stance of the people he represents. To suggest that Ukraine's president is personally benefiting from prolonging the war and is doing so against the will of the Ukrainian people is categorically false. As I keep saying, the stakes are existential. On the one hand, you have Ukrainians fighting for their survival and freedom from authoritarianism. On the other, you have Russians fighting for the revival of a vanished empire. In the same way that North Koreans talk longingly about the future war in which they'll joyfully reunite with the lost southern half of their country, so do Russian imperialists like Putin believe that an objectively good and fair world is one in which the people of Donetsk, Kyiv, and even the Carpathians answer to Moscow. The belief that these are just 2 bickering parties that needed to be brought face to face to hash out their grievances is naive. Compromise will happen when one side decides to turn its back on its core beliefs about how the world should be, and neither seems close to that paradigm shift yet. That's not to say that both sides are immune to mounting pressures. Ukraine faces manpower shortages and questions of how far aid, which is now largely coming from Europe, can stretch and for how long, while 4 years of economic and psychological hardship have taken a heavy toll on the civilian population. Russia is faced with sanctions, shortages of resources, and long-term economic and cultural isolation that also have a trickle-down effect on national morale. Both countries are facing a demographic crisis years down the line from both people killed by war and people fleeing the war, who won't come back even when it's over. While Ukraine suffers much more acutely in the short term, Russia will also be feeling the effects of the war for generations to come. Trump got his calculus wrong. The brutality of the war makes it harder to end, not simpler. I'm joined today by Gabrielis Landsbergis, Lithuania's former Minister of Foreign Affairs, who can tell us a little bit more about why peace talks have stalled. But to that point, is it fair to say that peace talks have stalled? Is there any hope of them kicking into a new gear organically?
Well, from the information that we have, I believe that the talks revolve around one single major question, and that's about the territorial concessions from Ukrainian side. As far as we're informed by that the position of Ukrainian side, by the president of Ukraine or now by Mr. Budanov, is that Ukraine is not ready to negotiate on that question. I'm totally not surprised. I would be actually surprised if Ukraine would start negotiating on that, because that's a very slippery slope, from any country's perspective. And I believe that Ukraine now, with some changes in the government, still believe that it has a realistic chance on shifting the game on the battlefield, putting actual pressure on Russia without major support by its allies.
If a diplomatic solution can't be reached through peace talks, what are the alternatives at this point? Could you name some of the most probable outcomes?
Well, I mean, Ukrainians are successfully raising the numbers of killed and injured Russians on the battlefield. And I think that this is probably a bit of a change that we're seeing by the new Minister of Defense, where, he is reconfiguring or maybe offering new ways how to look at this, right? So that's a very clear, calculatable indicator that Ukrainians are able to measure and try to achieve. If casualties go high enough on the Russian side that the mobilization drives or even the recruiting drives become ever more difficult, so that's one way to look at how do you build up pressure on Russia. Second thing is that still, even though, I'm usually saying that, European allies and Western allies are not supporting Ukraine as much as they should, but still the 90 billion euro package is a message both to Russia and also to Ukraine, right? So Ukraine has an argument that allies are still there. Europe, with all its difficulties, have not yet turned away. But for Russians as well, if they expected to exhaust Europeans, through the change of governments, through the political situation that we have in Europe, that didn't happen as well. And lastly, here is the economic pressure, right? So so we can, even though Russia's economy is rather resilient, it's difficult to expect it to collapse, but the difficulties, they do seep in, and they start reaching a person in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and in other cities where they do understand that there is a price for the war, and they might expect that price to go away. So that is kind of the bundle of a strategy that we're probably seeing here.
What are the key ways that pressure could be applied to Russia in these negotiations, and does it have to come directly from Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say, but I mean, I don't see how the United States is currently building pressure on Russia. Unfortunately, I've seen just quite the opposite direction. I believe that in his mind, and maybe his advisors are thinking that it was supposed to be much easier to put pressure on Ukraine by removing removing the weapons, stopping major support. I mean, even though there's some support still reaching through the European procurements from the United States, but I mean it's definitely it's 10 times, 20 times smaller than it has been. Then the diplomatic pressure, public pressure on President Zelensky, kind of that was the expectation that it would help make sure that that the Ukrainians do accept the very bad terms of the deal. But we have not seen anything like that on Russia, right? So I think that the expectation was that if we roll out the red carpet in Alaska, if we return Russia to some sort of a normalization with the United States, maybe that would somehow show Russians that there is a chance of that would give them a reason to negotiate in good faith. But we know Russians from long ago, they take whatever is given and they ask for more. So it's exactly the same situation now.
And where does Europe fit into the peace process now, and where does it want to fit in?
Well, Europe is awakening to a fact that it's is more or less on its own now when it comes to Ukraine. So there are talks that Europe should open its negotiation channels with Putin. President Macron alluded to that. I consider that Europe is still in a phase of trying to figure out its place, where it should be, because just on its own, opening a channel with Putin doesn't mean much, right? So what's, to go to Moscow to be humiliated, What are we going to say, right? So you have to build a situation that would force Putin to reach out to Europe on its own. And there are conditions that could allow that, right? So one is, for example, if Europe can guarantee the funding. And as I said previously, Putin might have hoped that Europe will be unable, to fund Ukraine. Now Europe is saying, well, at least 2 years, we have this tranche that, that is going to help Ukraine sustain its defense effort. But we can talk further, right? So we have to raise stakes where Putin would see, okay, that the situation is not necessarily developing to his advantage, and this is where any talks, Ukrainian European talks, with Russians could take place, but not now. So whatever is happening now, I mean, it's awakening, but not yet a strategy, and then we still have to develop a strategy as to how Europe sees itself.
Okay, we've gone over why 12 months of negotiations have failed. The clumsy handling, the inconsistent pressure, and no bridging of irreconcilable worldviews. So are we going to be sitting here next March asking why 2 years of talks haven't yielded any results? Or is there any chance that this war could end diplomatically in 2026? Peace talks will only work if the underlying power dynamics shift. Ukraine is already doing its part. Russia is not. Russia doesn't have a reason to participate enthusiastically in peace talks when it benefits as long as the war continues, and loses out on potential gains if the war ends now without the possibility to reinvade later. Until the war becomes permanently untenable for Russia, there's nothing that Trump or anyone can say that will lead to a ceasefire, much less to a lasting peace. So could there be a peace deal this year? The odds aren't zero. It's within the realm of possibility. But no one I know here in Ukraine is overly optimistic. Something major will have to shift for the talks to start working, and no one knows exactly what it will be or is counting on it to happen within a specific time frame. If Trump has taught the world anything, it's to expect the unexpected, or maybe just not have any expectations at all. Ukraine is prepared to keep fighting Russia with or without America's help, but has no intention of becoming uncooperative with the peace process. Ukraine wants more than any other country for these talks to be successful. More than Russia does, that's for sure. But for the man who claimed to be holding all the cards a year ago, Trump doesn't seem so confident in his hand now.
This week's member question is Donald Trump a Russian asset? And I'm sorry to disappoint a lot of people out there, but he almost certainly is not. Yes, he acts a lot like a Russian asset. He appears to more or less do Putin's bidding in terms of the war in Ukraine without actually applying any pressure on Russia to end the war. But we need to apply a bit of Occam's razor here, and the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. And the simplest explanation for this is that the current White House administration is just woefully unprepared and unequipped to deal with Russia. We saw this earlier this week with Steve Witkoff insisting in an interview with Tucker Carlson, I think, that he is adamant that Putin has never been more anything else but straight with him. And anyone who knows the slightest thing about how Russia and Putin operates knows that this is complete nonsense, and Russia lies about everything, particularly in the geopolitical sphere. And the current administration is looking ahead to not the end of the war in Ukraine, but they're looking ahead to what happens afterwards. And they see the world as a business opportunity. And I believe that I'm not inside their heads, but I think it's kind of obvious when you frame it like this, that they simply see more business opportunities with Russia than they do with Ukraine. And the current peace negotiations, don't look at them as peace negotiations. It's the Americans and the Trump administration building a relationship with Putin so that they can maximize the business opportunities once the war ends. And they know that if they apply pressure now, more sanctions, things like that, things that could actually put pressure on Putin to end the war, that also runs the risk of some sort of domestic turmoil, which could topple Putin and could be the end of the Putin regime. And if Putin isn't in power and the war ends, then America can't necessarily do business with them. So I think it would be great to have a conspiracy theory that came true and for Trump to be a Russian asset and for everybody to be able to go, yep, knew it, told you so. But I think the reality is more mundane and unfortunately a lot more depressing than that.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you appreciated this video, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, and we're so grateful for your support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.